Welcome to the Dynasty Dummies podcast. I am your host, Zach Reed, and tonight is J. Mike Check at J. Mike Check joining me to help steer the ship. J. Mike, how you doing this evening?
Smells a little bit like lobster in here, but I will take it. I will take it.
Only the best for you. Fresh, never frozen, never canned.
No, I'm glad to be with you. I'm glad to be with you. This will be a good time tonight. Kyle, we love you, man. We love you, and I'm excited to be able to keep the seat warm for just a moment, if I may.
Yeah, well, and appreciate it. This has been a weird, like 2 months, 2.5 months, 3 months, however long that we've been going on with quarantine and social distancing, and I know that for me, it's strange sometimes to feel like I should be podcasting because there's so much going on in the world that is far more important than fantasy football that to hold it up in front of me, it makes it feel small. But then the other part of it is I need this, man. Like, and I know that there are other people that there's some degree of normalcy being able to sit down and talk with, my friends, talk with you, Jay, Mike, and with other people. I mean, I've been on the open bar and I've done that. And I was on with Bill and what's that podcast? You know what I'm talking about? Bill McCarthy.
Fantasy Timeline.
That's the one. They're fantastic. So yeah, like I've been on with the Fantasy Timeline, and so some degree of normalcy, even though it's odd juxtaposed against things that matter so much more than this.
Yeah, and that's the thing that we're all now faced with. It is not just what really matters, but we've all been forced to, whether we like it or not, look in the mirror and step face to face with the things that we hold dear, the things that we do, and the why we do what we do, and that includes even our fantasy football processes, if we so deem that as worthy of our time and or distraction. So this is a lot of fun to be able to walk through just a lot of things that are on your brain, deconstruct, reconstruct, a lot of things that we feel in terms of processes that may not have served us so well. And I think that in the end, whenever the end is of all of this quarantine and stay-at-home order and COVID mess that we're dealing with, I think that a lot of us will come out on the other side much more focused, much more in a place to be able to make sure that we are doing well with the time that we're given. So I'm excited for that too.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. I hope people kind of focus and realize what's important. I know that for me, it's been kind of a double-edged sword because I was off work for 2 months, but I was home with the boys, with my family. And so you start to realize what's important to you. And part of that for me, I'm a reader, I'm a writer. And so to decompress and to get away from fantasy football a little bit, because I felt like it was a little bit diminished. It wasn't deserving of my time. So I was reading Moneyball. I don't know if you've read Moneyball, but it's baseball. It's the Oakland A's and the early 2000s, and it was written by Michael Lewis, who's a fantastic author. But I was reading Moneyball, and all of a sudden I found myself thinking about fantasy football. And that to me was a little light bulb that said, okay, even though you're spending time away from it, even though you're trying to decompress, it's still on your mind. It's part of what is normal in life. And if we can grasp onto something normal, that's a good thing, I think.
Is it weird that when you say Moneyball, speaking of normal, this is not normal at all. I used to keep up with baseball really well. The first thing I thought about was Jason Giambi. I mean, that's that era, right? That's the Oakland era. Okay.
In fact, he was him and his departure to the Yankees was actually the jumping off point for the book, because once Giambi left, once Johnny Damon went to the Red Sox, and once their closer, whose name escapes me, but Isringhausen, left for St. Louis, the A's now had to figure out how they were going to win with, far less money than everybody else. And so the whole idea of the book, and it's worth reading even if you're not a baseball fan, because it ties into fantasy football. It ties into a lot of things we do. It's the idea was finding places to win on the margins. And we talk about that often. And the specific chapter that I was reading that took me to fantasy football was a chapter about a guy named Voros McCracken. He sounds like a Bond villain, I guess. He's got maybe the hairless cat that he's stroking in a monocle. But he did he did this really in-depth project, and he's an analytics guy, and he did this project where he developed a statistic called defense independent pitching, and which essentially took all of the other variables except for the pitcher out of the equation and tried to prove which pitchers were best. And he did this because Greg Maddux had back-to-back seasons where the first season he had like a 1.75 ERA. The next season he had like a 3.5 ERA. And there was no difference between his strikeouts, his walks, the home runs he gave up. It just was, his defense didn't play as well, or luck, or whatever you want to attribute to that. But Voros McCracken started to try to figure out how he could simplify pitching and take out all of the other variables and just give you the pitcher. And the actual math behind it was pretty complicated, because he started doing like things with trajectory and velocity and where balls landed and all this stuff. But once he did that, he realized that he could come up with the same results by giving you simply walks, strikeouts, and home runs. And that really got me thinking, because we come at this sometimes. I'm not a mathematician. Full disclosure, I am a writer. I can do math. I do not like it. I beat my head against math, and it's not enjoyable for me. I can do it. I am an engineer, and like that sort of thing I can do, but it's not something that makes me happy. And so when I saw something that I could simplify, started going after that. And I was trying to find out if I could come up with an easier and simpler way to approach running backs. And so what I started with, because we all know receptions matter. Receptions matter more than anything. If you are anywhere within earshot of Scott Barrett, you'll hear the number 2.83. And if you listen to Fantasy Football Engineering this week, that was the number that kept coming up. 2.83 times more. They're worth more than a carry. And so targets had to be in there. And then, to me, rushing attempts, obviously, for a running back had to be in there. And so I started looking at those things to try to simplify looking at running backs and try to attack how we're approaching running backs.
So with all of that said, Mr. I'm not math. I know that there's not a lead in like that without some serious work that was done on your end, which begs the question, does it tell me, whatever you're about to tell me, does it tell me that Wes Hills is the sleeper candidate of the 2020 offseason? That's really what we need to know.
Yeah, I think we're probably safe leaving Wes Hills where he is. Okay. And it's interesting because I'm not sure I found out anything specifically. And I bounced this off Peter Howard, and I said, look, I found that Austin Eckler was stupid efficient last year. Like he had more points per involvement, and that's what I'm basically calling this is running back involvement. We're going back, throw it back to baseball. It's RBI, running back involvement, and so it's carries and targets are the main things that because you can take yards and those are affected by your team. They're affected by your quarterback. They're affected by your line. They're affected by the defense that's playing against you. Same thing with touchdowns and all of that. But to me, the targets and the carries are dictated by how the team thinks of the running back. Because the more highly the team thinks of the running back, the more involvement that running back is going to have. So again, Eckler had more points per involvement than anybody. He was higher than Christian McCaffrey. Obviously, he didn't get the involvement that McCaffrey did. Raheem Mostert was really good in a very small sample size, but he didn't get included in the passing game very much. So he was crazy efficient with like touchdowns and yardage. Receptions obviously matter a ton. This is something that we've been banging the drum on forever. That's been kind of my baby since I started with the Dynasty Dummies and coming into your ears. Like that was it. Receptions matter so much for running backs. And there are a couple other things that, like, Mark Ingram is in a fantastic spot, which also makes me like J.K. Dobbins because he'll be in a fantastic spot once Mark Ingram is completely out of there. Melvin Gordon is actually sneaky good, and he was sneaky good last year. Like, you don't think of Melvin Gordon last year as being a good player, but he actually was. In the small sample that he was there. And David Montgomery saw the 18th most usage last season, which is good, but he was barely mid-30s in terms of turning it into fantasy points, which is not good.
Yeah, and that's one of the most fascinating parts of this for me is the fact that we're looking at something now that tells us at least two things definitively, that your opportunities certainly have the opportunity to carry the day for you, regardless of how efficient you are with your opportunities. The opportunities themselves give light to not even necessarily a predictive state, but they just give light to the fact that if you're going to be involved in the offense, if we're stripping everything away to give us this runway or to give us this avenue that says, even if our offensive line isn't good, we can try to get you the ball through the air. And even if our team can't protect our quarterback, we want to get you the ball on the ground and do all these different things with you. But one of the things that I eventually want to be able to, and I don't know that we'll be able to do this effectively tonight, but I do want to try to be able to get us out of this web of really interesting things. And then what does it look like for us to possibly apply these edges? Because I think that there's something to be unearthed here, whether it be that pearl in that clam or some nugget of gold here that we've got to dig around to really work to. But yeah, let's keep diving here.
Well, and my hope is and we talked about this before we jumped on, but my hope is that there's somebody out there who is much smarter than at least myself, who is within earshot, who can say, oh, well, that leads me down another path that, to me, I initially started looking at this again to try to simplify running backs, but also to try to there was the big Miles Sanders debate. And so the Miles Sanders debate, there was actually something to that I wanted to see if Miles Sanders, as good as he played last year, is somebody that I'm interested in drafting at 17 overall at the running back 11. We spoke about it on the open bar last or 2 weeks ago, and you and I both looked at each other and said, I don't know if he's a running back one. I think he's kind of on that cusp, he was very, very efficient with what he did last year. He was 17th in fantasy points per involvement. It's not per touch because you're not necessarily catching all your targets. But then if you take away all of the guys, there were 8 players who were kind of scat backs, who were the pass catchers on their team. And if you do that, all of a sudden he's a top 10 fantasy points per involvement back. And if you believe that Miles Sanders is going to be more involved in that team, that's something that's interesting. Maybe not at 17 overall in a startup, but it's also useful to me because if you looked at Miles Sanders last year at this time, we'll fly back, we'll get in the DeLorean, we'll crank it up to 88 miles an hour. Look out for the Libyans, we're good. He was 50th overall. He was running back 22 at this time last year. And last year, when we talked about Miles Sanders on this show, Kyle and I said, we love Miles Sanders. He's really talented. The landing spot says he's probably not going to be as valuable this year as he will be next year. And flash forward now, he is running back 11. He went up 11 spots in 1 year, 1 calendar year. Now back up. Take this away from Miles Sanders, even though everyone wants to debate Miles Sanders. What that tells me is, even though we've been talking about running backs being overvalued in rookie drafts because they're going ahead of, in Superflex, they're sometimes going ahead of the quarterbacks. In one quarterback, they're going the first 5 off the board. Are they really overvalued? Because you're never going to get them for that price again. And so these are all, I mean, again, I've got so many thoughts coming out of this one Google sheet that I banged in some rudimentary equations to, but I'm not sure. I don't have the answers.
Yeah, and let's go back to Miles Sanders just for a second. When we're looking at the probably what is now should be known as the Miles Sanders conundrum, because I feel like there are people on all sides of how they feel about Miles Sanders. Even if you take a look back at last season, obviously the 16 games, but he wasn't starting in all of them, and he didn't get the consistent work until the end of the year. We've heard all these things. But I find this to be helpful for Miles Sanders, or at least his outlook. And it didn't really just hit me until you were just talking through this. So let's kind of walk through, like you were saying. We know that Miles Sanders obviously was going top 3 rookie pick last year. We know that regardless of how people feel or felt about him as a prospect, we know that he can flat out get it done in the NFL. We also know that he's got a great pair of mitts, and he's able to make the most out of probably anyone that they could even hope to have in the backfield for Philadelphia. We know that even in limited work, he saw 179 just rushes last year. If you include in his targets, it's over 250 or 240, 250 opportunities that he saw, actual involvement in the plays. So when I look at Miles Sanders and then I look at basically compare or take all that information into account, we apply that, or we take a look at the ADP and we look at the running backs that we find him in the midst of. So right now for May, shout out to the good folks over at DLF. They've got the ADP here. They've got him settled just behind Jonathan Taylor and Josh Jacobs. And then they've got him in front of the likes of J.K. Dobbins, Derrick Henry, DeAndre Swift, and Austin Eckler. There is literally one person in that entire grouping that I feel like we can point to and say they'll probably have a greater involvement in the offense, and that's Derrick Henry, just because they're willing to give Derrick Henry the ball 1,000,000,001 times. But in the event that Miles Sanders for whatever reason, gets more of a lion's share of what we know is likely going to still be a committee because it's Peterson and it's Philadelphia. If for whatever reason he's able to start quicker and he's able to get those, 15, 12 carries a game, and then he's still going to be getting the targets that he's getting. And what happens if he fools around and pushes 80 targets, 90 targets? We know they're hurting for pass catchers in Philadelphia. So with Miles Sanders, I feel like it's really interesting to see, because when we look at what he did with the opportunities, when we look at basically his overall involvement, he now becomes someone. And Zach, this messes with me a lot. I think he may be undervalued because we know that he can get it done from an efficiency standpoint. So he's not going to necessarily have to have he's not going to have 300 touches to really do work for our fantasy teams. And we know that if he does get any kind of an increase from likely his 240, 250 that he got, we're still looking at a guy that's going to be top 10, again, fringe, but top 10. But we're looking at upside that's just through the roof.
Yeah, and that's the thing with all of this, with looking at all of this, is the biggest upside comes from receptions. You already know that Miles Sanders is a tremendous receiver. You saw him get 63 targets last year. Again, in basically what, 2/3 of a season that he actually played significant snaps.
Right.
And there were times where he was the best pass catcher on the field for Philadelphia last year. So yeah, I mean, like, there is some really, really significant upside with Miles Sanders, and that is, I mean, those are things that win leagues, because if you can draft a player at a position and have the kind of the upward mobility. I mean, it's the same thing where last year, if you drafted Lamar Jackson, if you were getting Lamar Jackson in the 6th, 7th round of even super flex, he was going 5th, 6th, 7th, that won leagues. So if you have the mobility, although, taking him at 17 isn't quite the same as a 7th round Lamar Jackson, but there is that upward mobility. And there's also the fact that he is young. I would take him over Josh Jacobs every day of the week, twice on Sunday.
Yep.
Just because of the pass catching upside. And Kyle tried to pin me down last year with Sony, and he was, who are you taking between Sony Michel and Sanders? And I said, I'm taking Sanders because of the receiving upside, and that is one of the most important things to me when looking at a running back, both starting running backs, and when I'm looking at filling out the back end of my roster. Yeah. If I'm looking at starting running backs, I want the guy who catches the ball. I want. I mean, obviously you want McCaffrey, but I want Eckler. I want, that type of player where, Kamara, Miles Sanders, Dalvin Cook, even there are going to be some guys that are undervalued this year because they're a little older and they've been out of mind for a little bit. So somebody like Kenyon Drake. Kenyon Drake was stupid efficient with his touches last year, but also if you look at what David Johnson did, and I know this is because he was hurt and blah, 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 but David Johnson was the 10th most fantasy points per involvement of any player in the NFL. And you think that, like, he had a bad year because, he got hurt in weeks 6 or 7, and then was terrible. But he was a top 5 back the first 5 weeks of the season, and so somebody like Kenyon Drake in that offense is going to be a value. Somebody like James Conner, because he was injured last year, because he's fallen down rankings. If he is healthy in Pittsburgh, he's going to see receptions. He's going to see carries. So that's a player that I think actually has some value. Todd Gurley, these, the old running backs that everybody has left for dead, that, yeah, you don't really want them on your team because they're going to die there, but the price right now to acquire somebody like Todd Gurley is really low. And if you can get 2 seasons out of Todd Gurley where he is putting up, mid running back 2 to potentially running back 1 numbers, that's a windfall.
Yeah, and when you look in the case of both of those guys, particularly with Gurley and Melvin Gordon, obviously same draft class. They've been compared a lot over the years, and even to the point of now being on brand new teams after seeing their star fall in the cities that where they became household names. We're looking at now, but this is and even if we can tie in and let's include David Johnson in this, and let's compare all of that to what. Let's compare all of that to Josh Jacobs and Miles Sanders, like we were just discussing. All 3 of those guys find new homes, and they're brought in to be able to basically give life, give a boost, give anything to these running games and to these passing games, to a couple of offenses that have a lot of high hopes moving forward that they weren't getting from the folks that they had before. So we know, obviously, people have said a lot. Philip Lindsay isn't the pass catcher. And even though he was really good in 18, he kind of took a little step back in 19. And then they had to go out and get their hitman in Melvin Gordon. Like, hey, we need to make it happen. We're hiring Melvin Gordon to get it done. Same thing for Todd Gurley after Uncle Devonta Freeman. Basically just couldn't hold it together with health and everything else. Now, when we look at those situations in Las Vegas and Philadelphia, they're very opposed to each other in that we saw Philadelphia not necessarily address that running back position. They're not a team yet, even though they wanted in on the Freeman sweepstakes, and he decided to take his ball and play elsewhere. They're on the Carlos Hyde sweepstakes.
Yep.
We're also looking at so basically it's still Miles Sanders, and we're still looking at Boston Scott. Whereas everything in Las Vegas continues to tell us that Josh Jacobs they do not necessarily want to leverage him, even though he likely could do it. They want to be able to leverage him for just carrying the ball, because we're looking at the fact that last season DeAndre Washington and Jalen Richard both were out receiving him, basically out targeting him, and now they re-signed Jalen Richard. They bring in Lynn Bowden. They announce him as a running back. All these things. So when you take a look at the young guns who we just had last year and we were really super excited about, and compare them with a couple of guys that we're looking at having the opportunity to really bolster and take a pretty large majority of involvement from whoever was there before, I find those comparisons specifically between those types, because we're looking at 2 different subsets of players, 2 different situations, 2 different and they couldn't be more different in terms of the career and everything else to this point. But we're looking at some guys who you're going to be able to show major value on, but specifically with Gurley and even David Johnson and Melvin Gordon. I'm so intrigued by this, because this opens up a really, really interesting Pandora's box for me.
Well, and this gets back to also types of running backs and what you're seeing, and the reason why, again, Miles Sanders and Josh Jacobs are viewed very similarly. In fact, Josh Jacobs is actually a little bit higher in the pantheon of running backs than Miles Sanders. But when I look at them, I don't think there's any reason why Miles Sanders shouldn't be well above Josh Jacobs. If you're looking to add a running back to your team, I want the guy who catches passes. And it's the same thing. I mean, Todd Gurley is going to come in there to Atlanta and be a receiving back as well as carry the ball, because that's what they do. They throw to their running backs. They always have. They will continue to do that. And Gurley has proven that he is adept enough in the passing game to do that. Same thing. I think you're right with Melvin Gordon. Is you look where the receptions last year went away from Philip Lindsay, and I think that will continue. They don't necessarily want to throw to Philip Lindsay, which leaves Melvin Gordon. And Melvin Gordon wasn't a guy coming out of college that I expected to be a pass catcher. Flat out, he wasn't. He was not a player that had the pedigree coming out of Wisconsin to be a pass catcher. He was not a player that I was expecting to be a pass catcher. And when he started out, he wasn't a pass catcher. But you saw the injury to Woodhead kind of force the hand in at that point San Diego, and then he stepped up. And once they saw him be that pass catcher, it was just the floodgates were open. Look, you said that about Josh Jacobs. I think the same would be true with Jacobs, but they don't want it. Sony Michel. The same would be true with Sony Michel in New England. Sony Michel was a pass catcher in college. He was great in space. He was a guy that you could get on a swing pass or a wheel route and let him catch the ball in space and make another 25, 30, 40 yards. That's not what they do in New England. The same is true for Philadelphia, but Miles Sanders is the pass catcher. He is the pass. He's the guy that they want to be involved. He's the James White in that offense, although he's a better runner than James White and more involved in the running game.
So let me pose this to you with a couple of guys, and we'll just continue to dip our toes in the 19 rookie class. Couple of guys that people probably have very different thoughts of right now. One, David Montgomery, and one, Devin Singletary. We watched David Montgomery not be fantastic with the opportunities that he was given, and we saw Tariq Cohen, a guy that obviously was electric in 18, was less so in 2019, but still was able to garner over 100 targets. And talk about taking opportunity away from David Montgomery, and even with what Devin Singletary did in his first year. And then now we fast forward and they add Zach Moss, even though they get rid of Frank Gore, they bring in Zach Moss. I believe it was third round that they chose him. We're looking at the guys that we would hope for to being the A side in the committee, and maybe they are so. But we're looking at, in all likelihood, limited ceilings. What are your thoughts on a couple of those guys as people project bigger things from them moving forward?
Well, I'll start off with Montgomery because I was really high on Montgomery coming out of that class last year, and I envisioned him being a 250 carry running back. When we had that conversation, you laughed at me when I said that. I remember the show, and you laughed, and I said, "Oh, he's going to be a 250 carry run." He was,
and I think I remember saying, "Zach, there's no way that he's going to walk into in my Peter Howard voice. There's no way he's going to be walking in to the vacated carries, to the carries that Jordan Howard's leaving behind. There's no way, and I'll be daggone if he didn't get right up there and bump his head on it."
Yeah, he was 242 carries, but I was still wrong on David Montgomery because he only had 33 targets. They're not using him in the passing game. And if they don't use him in the passing game, it doesn't matter how many carries he has. That offensive line and that offense is bad enough that he can't be effective running behind that line and with Trubisky at the helm. He can't be effective enough for fantasy to be that player that we expected. And it's disappointing. It would be really nice to see more volume through the air for Montgomery. But I think that you see Tariq Cohen take so much of that. And I mean, that team is one of the most frustrating teams for me to watch because their offensive play calling just defies logic. Like it seems like they're always trying to play like 4-dimensional chess, and really all you need to be doing is playing checkers or cribbage, or you just go forward. Just you don't have to bring in Cordarrelle Patterson to run the ball up the middle when you've got two running backs who can do that sort of thing. And so that's frustrating for me. As far as Devin Singletary, he wasn't as good with his touches as people think. I think he was targeted 40 times or 41 times, but he was 29th in fantasy points per involvement in a play. So like he wasn't one of those guys who was really efficient. He wasn't a player that was really exciting on a per target basis. And then you add Moss, who, for whatever Zach Moss is, he was Pro Football Focus's number one running back. He is loved by certain sections of the community. And for me, he was running back 6 or 7 in this class. Like, he's not bad. He's not a bad running back. And so you throw him in, taking over some volume, running the ball. And I don't see necessarily the huge uptick in volume for Singletary. And so then what do you do with him?
That is the question. That's the question. And I think with all of this really, because again, one of the things is, if we're going to try to leverage these things and leverage basically the information that we're gathering, that we don't necessarily know what it's telling us yet. We know that it's pointing in many directions. We don't necessarily know how to hone it in yet, and maybe it's not in the right hands of the folks who
certainly is not
want the network to be able to do it, because that's gonna be quite the undertaking. But I think that you've come across and stumbled upon, again, this isn't rocket science that we're dealing with. This is advanced analytics. This is taking very simple things and in a very Dynasty Dummies way, saying, hey, this is information that we see here, and we're not sure what to do with it, but we're going to continue to move forward with it. But let me ask you this as well: if we're able to try to apply this, or at least talk about what it looks like to leverage this information for where we are now, does it behoove us, and I won't say regardless of league or roster sizes and things of that nature, but in the majority of instances, is this going to lend toward, because I know that you and I both have been guys who like to build through the wide receiver position on our teams. Does this to some degree make you want to flip that on its head to be more shallow at wide receiver and a lot deeper at running back for the folks who may be walking into or bumping their heads on opportunity that could be down the pipe?
So I think that your hand is kind of forced in the first 2 rounds in a startup, because right now, if you're in a 1 quarterback startup, you're 7 of your first 12, according to DLF's ADP, 7 of your first 12 players off the board are running backs, 14 of the first 24. So there are 14 running backs coming off the board in the first 2 rounds, which means you need to get a running back early. And you and I have discussed this ad nauseum for a very long time. I was staunchly in the corner of, you draft wide receivers early and often, you figure out running backs late, and then you attack running backs in the draft. I still think that this says attack running backs in the draft. I think there's no question about that, because I do believe that, much the same as you hear said about quarterbacks and Superflex, the rookie draft is the cheapest you're ever going to find them. I think that is the same with these running backs. And so even though they're going to be the first 5 players off the board in rookie drafts, that's still going to be the cheapest that you will ever find them. But looking at a startup now, it does shift me. It does say, you need to have a running back in those first 2 rounds. You have to. So now it's a kind of a modified. I mean, I didn't necessarily call it zero RB. I didn't play because it's dynasty. You're not, you're never going to play straight zero RB forever. Like that's not a thing. Or I guess maybe it is, but it takes someone with a little more intestinal fortitude than I have. But I think that you can start, you can start a draft where if you're in the top 5 of that draft, if you come away with someone like Saquon or Christian McCaffrey or Kamara or Ezekiel Elliott, then you're happy. And then you can start hitting running back. If you're toward the back end of the draft, in terms of order, and you start your squad with somebody like Devontae Adams or Chris Godwin, and then you can come back around that turn and hit somebody like Clyde Edwards-Helaire or Chubb or Jonathan Taylor or Miles Sanders, then all of a sudden we're talking. You've got to start. And then I still think that you pound those wide receivers because there are so many rounds, 3 through about 6. There are so many good young wide receivers with upside right now that you can just hammer that. And then looking at some of these players who are in the vein of zero RB, once you start filling out your roster, once you start looking toward the back end of your roster, guys like Matt Breida, who is in Miami, and yeah, you've got Jordan Howard there, but Matt Breida has been a very good pass catcher, even though I didn't expect that out of him. He has proven in the NFL that he was a decent pass catcher. I think you're going to see him in that role. He's a pass catcher plus, because if Jordan Howard gets hurt, you're going to see a huge increase in Matt Breida's role. Same thing with a guy like Tony Pollard, a guy like Chase Edmonds in Arizona, Giovanni Bernard. Always Giovanni Bernard. He's on all of my rosters. He's like he was the guy I always pointed to when I first started talking about pass catcher plus. He is the player who is going to catch 40, 50 balls in a season. But if there is an injury to the starter, all of a sudden he can assume that role as a bell cow. I mean, he's not a real bell cow, but 6, 7, 8 games, yeah, he can get it done for you. And even somebody, you're not even going to have to spend any capital because Jerick McKinnon is down at like 240 in ADP. But a guy like Jerick McKinnon, who, yeah, injuries, it's been ugly, but he is a player who, if given the right opportunity, especially in that San Francisco offense, could be an absolute monster. So that's how I'd approach it. You have to have a running back in the first couple rounds. There's no doubt about it. And the way people are drafting running backs now, your hand is forced. You've got to take them early.
And this, again, this kind of leads into more further down this rabbit hole that we're in. let me ask this, because I feel you on that. And like you were saying, rounds 3 through 6, those wide receivers, it's so many names that you like, okay, yeah, I can still leave this draft. I can still leave my team and feel really good about not just the ages of my players that I have in that range in terms of some longevity, but also for some production and value in that range. So let's walk through this as we continue to unspin this web to some degree. I'm not sure how far we've made it out, but I really like the discussion that we've had so far. With some guys who were in the top 10 to 15 probably in the league when it comes to probably top 10 when it comes to overall opportunities, where the Bills finally come due for them at this point. I'm talking about guys who absolutely crushed it in 2019, like Derrick Henry, Leonard Fournette, and out of the blue, who would have thunk it other than one Kyle LeBrecq, Aaron Jones, RB2 last season. We saw in terms of targets, we saw both of those guys, Fournette and Aaron Jones, be top 11 at the position. Fournette, after everyone for the longest, Far seen that he's not been one to exercise his ability to catch the ball. All of a sudden, involvement out the wazoo. Derrick Henry. Oh, you want to talk about who led the league in rushing attempts? Over 300 attempts himself. Derrick Henry. All these guys, again, essentially last year of contracts. Derrick Henry on the franchise tag. I've long thought, probably for way too long now, the last 6 to 9 months, about this idea of not holding on to much in the way of these guys on second contracts. However, here we are with 3 guys wildly productive, wildly involved in their offenses, and I don't know that their offenses or that their teams did a lot to say we're not going to be running this back again with what looks pretty similar, because all of those teams, except for the Jacksonville Jaguars, but certainly for Tennessee and Green Bay, we saw a lot of obviously success and the teams making the playoffs. So I'm trying to wrap my mind around how do I, because even if we're looking at ADP, we're looking at ADP for all those guys in terms of just at the position. We're looking at, again, Aaron Jones, who finishes RB2 last year, right now at running back 17, behind all of the rookies upcoming this year, behind all those guys. Right behind him, we're looking at Leonard Fournette, and that's 18th overall at the position. And we've got Derrick Henry at 13th, settled behind aforementioned Miles Sanders and J.K. Dobbins, who's yet to take one snap in the NFL. I don't know how we marry this involvement that we know that these guys are having versus the very likelihood that we could blink and all 3 of those guys could be out of their A side in the committee or bell cow roles come 2021.
So for me, it becomes a value proposition. I think if you look at Fournette and you look at Aaron Jones, you're not going to get the value for what you're going to get or should get out of production. I just don't think you're going to. I mean, maybe you can dangle Aaron Jones in front of somebody who's a truther. Kyle, if you're listening, maybe I've got Aaron Jones in a league. Maybe we can talk. But I think that those are 2 players that you're going to end up. I don't see a reason why Leonard Fournette doesn't come close to what he did last year. This year, they haven't done much around him. They haven't done much that scares me. And so I think you're going to see Fournette with big volume and Fournette with potentially quite a few targets. And so he's worth more to me on my team than he is trading. The same is probably true with Aaron Jones. Although Aaron Jones is a unique case because we love him. Every time he's been given the role, he's been fantastic. But the Packers still don't trust him. And Joe pointed out at FF Trader Joe in our chat this afternoon that once Aaron Jones was arrested for marijuana, the Packers kind of full backed up from him, stopped trusting him, started looking elsewhere, drafting A.J. Dillon early in this, at least early for what we expected. I mean, they took him in the second round. I think he was 62nd overall. That was a really big statement to me by the Packers that Aaron Jones is at least on his way out of there at the end of this year, and it's not going to be pretty. When you look at somebody like Derrick Henry, though, now you look at the value proposition and say, maybe I can kick the can down the road on Derrick Henry. Maybe I can get one of these running backs that are young that are going to continue to gain value. Maybe I can add DeAndre Swift. Maybe I can add J.K. Dobbins. Maybe I can even get Miles Sanders because you've heard he's in a committee. I mean, there's no Derrick Henry is going to be the bull of the woods in Tennessee, but Miles Sanders is stuck in a committee. They just re-signed Corey Clement. I mean, they got Boston Scott. They don't want Miles Sanders. So maybe you can get Miles Sanders and have that receiving upside, have that guy who's firmly ensconced between like running back 17 and running back 10, but has running back 5 or 6 upside for Derrick Henry, who knows after this year what's going to happen.
Yeah, and with that said, are you and obviously no, I was just going to say maybe this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it regardless. It feels though these guys are prime candidates to move in season to teams that are competing if you're not in the mix, right?
Yes.
These are the prime candidates to and maybe even if you are competing, perhaps you're and shout out to Michael Sipes from Dynasty Trades HQ. He's one of those. He and I have had some talks, and he's one that's going to go down with the ship swinging. I am not moving my assets. I'm trying to make it until I'm mathematically eliminated from playoff contention. Whereas I'm more of the type that if I start to smell the oil leaking a little bit, I'm more apt to start unloading some things to lighten the load to try to be able to get things better for the future. Are you, with kind of everything that we know about these opportunities and how quickly things fade, and again, looking at all three of those types of guys, likely not looking at near the same value or work in 2021, are you okay with them being on your roster and holding them in that instance?
Well, I mean, it really depends on the team I've got. It really depends on if Derrick Henry is one of the cogs that is going to take my team to a championship, then yeah, I'm hanging on to Derrick Henry. But if I'm looking at a team that is, third or fourth or fifth, and I'm going to need all of the breaks to happen this year to get there, it's hard to win a championship. Like, yes, it's hard to win a championship. And if you have a team that can get there, great. Throw everything you got at it, throw the anchor overboard and go. But be realistic with yourself. And I think that's one of the things that, and maybe we'll do this a little bit later. We like to do like a psychology show, a psychology episode at some point during the preseason, because there's a lot of it that goes on into fantasy. But one of the things you really need to do is be honest with yourself. You need to be able to look at your team and say, look, I am not a top 2 or 3 or 4 team in this league this year. And if you're not, there is no shame in trading a Derrick Henry to kick the can down the road and gain years and gain value with some of these young players who we've seen time and time again gain value. And so, Derrick Henry is probably not gaining any value from here. He's not. And so you've got to start looking at, there is the battle and there is the war. The battle is the season. And if you can win the battle, great. But if you can't, you need to retreat. You need to regroup. You need to set your sights on that war, which is your dynasty team, which is next year and the year after and the year after that. And having a running back who is 25 years old, turning 26, headed into his second contract with potentially a new team is not the building block that you are going to want on your team. And at that point, I mean, trade Derrick Henry, get your young player. If something happens that all of a sudden you turn something around and a miracle happens, go trade for Todd Gurley. Go trade for one of these guys who is cheaper, who can give you a reasonable facsimile of what Derrick Henry did. But don't get married to the idea that this player needs to be on your team.
Man, that's good stuff. That's so good. The in true dummy fashion, I feel like we've landed in a place to be able to really help people think for themselves and chew for themselves on some information to be able to recognize, obviously, the importance of involvement of these running backs, and basically seeing how we can better leverage those and find, as the smart folks say, as the analytics folks say, the inefficiencies that are out there to be had. Because now we're looking at, again, after our discussion, I've been wrestling all week, for 2 weeks, excuse me, regarding Miles Sanders, man. I've brought him up all over the place just because I keep seeing his name pop up everywhere. I keep seeing the fact and remembering the fact that, yes, he, for the first half of the 2019 season, we're looking at him being a guy who couldn't crack 50% snaps. And for the last half of the season, it's 80%, it's 75%, it's 90% of snaps. And we watched him be unleashed, even in the midst of folks being hurt. So I find all of this so intriguing. And I think that this merits and this warrants a lot of thoughts. And I had tweeted even just the other day just about patience. And it's not, and I think that it's the most underutilized, underused asset that's out there in Dynasty, not simply because people are too rash to do things, but patience and taking the time to really think things through gives you a greater understanding of the bigger picture and not just what you feel like in moments or what you feel like what feels like looks right according to Twitter or polls or everything else or groupthink and everything else. So it's not even necessarily about taking 15 years to make decisions. It's just a matter of making sure that you have a greater perspective of how the decisions that you're making for your team to move your squad forward impact, basically how those moves impact how you operate throughout the entire year.
Yeah, and I think that patience is a great thing to keep in mind, especially as more and more people transition from redraft into Dynasty, and Dynasty grows because you have this redraft mindset where if a player is not producing right now, and I was guilty of this when I first came in and started playing Dynasty. I shipped off DeAndre Hopkins for LaShawn McCoy, and I released Mike Evans because I didn't have enough spots to pick up somebody that I wanted. And I released Travis Kelce because he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. And like all of these things. And looking back, like that is completely, moronic. I earned the moniker dummy. I come by that honestly.
Got it honest.
it is. But and we cater to not necessarily the sharp league, not necessarily, a Scott Fish with pigs, or not necessarily a Ryan McDowell league or a John Bosch league, but we try to cater to the everyman that's playing Dynasty. And so patience is such a great word and a great thing to keep in mind, especially when you look at this running back class. You look at Jonathan Taylor coming into a situation where Marlon Mack is there, Naheem Hines is there. Maybe he's not going to be a 250 carry guy this year. The same thing with DeAndre Swift, where he landed in Detroit, and Kerryon Johnson is there, and Matt Patricia is running the ship aground, disregarding the foghorn and the lighthouse and just beaching the thing. The same thing with Dobbins, because Mark Ingram is there. Mark Ingram was fantastic in Baltimore last year. So if guys in your league are not being patient with some of these players, keep some feelers out there. Pay attention. And if you've got them on your team, be patient, because they are good and they are going to be good. And if you give up on them now, you're going to end up regretting it, just like you did when you gave up on Dalvin Cook when he was injured his first year, or when you gave up on Nick Chubb because he was behind Carlos Hyde. Like, these are good players. Be patient. It's Dynasty. It's the battle is nice, but it's about winning that war.
Come on. Come on, what better way to bring us toward the close here? I would be remiss if I didn't here at the 59-minute mark do my best Kyle LeBrecq impression and say, hey, that's probably our time for this week. But do you have final thoughts in terms of how we spin this forward, or do you feel pretty good about where we've landed with conversation? Anything else that you feel like is on your heart or mind at this point?
I like it. The one thing I would say is when you're looking at this rookie class, there are a couple guys, well, two and a half, that stand out to me that are going to be valuable pieces or could be valuable pieces as running backs going forward that people aren't necessarily all excited about talking about. The first one is LaMichael Pirine. He's there in New York. He's not necessarily a heralded running back, but he's a very good pass catcher. And you pointed out to me that Le'Veon Bell is up at number 4 in terms of the involvement score. Now, he's not up there in terms of points because obviously the Jets were terrible. And so if you don't think that offense gets any better going forward, maybe that's not a place to go. But LaMichael Pirine, if something happened to Le'Veon Bell, seems like an interesting player to me. We already talked a little bit about Lynn Bowden, but get Lynn Bowden on your team. He's such a dynamic athlete. And as a pass-catching running back, man, because you know he can run routes. You've seen him do it at Kentucky, and you also have seen him run the ball, albeit from the quarterback position. He's a guy that I want. I'm getting him in the 3rd round, late 2nd, early 3rd. Like, yeah, give me that. And the other one is Antonio Gibson. And he is a weird evaluation for me because I'm a film guy and there's not much film on him. I mean, he had 38 targets and like 20 something rushes. Like there's not a lot of film on him, but they don't have Chris Thompson there anymore in Washington. Darius Geis has not proven to me that he is a 3-down running back. Adrian Peterson has proven to me that he is not a 3-down running back. And having a weapon in Washington is not a bad thing. Especially, I don't believe that their quarterback play is going to be very good. And the way to mitigate a mediocre quarterback is to throw the ball to running backs and throw the ball to tight ends and throw the ball to somebody out of the slot. And so those 3 players, Pirine, Bowden, and Antonio Gibson, are guys that I am looking at getting in, the 3rd, 4th round of rookie drafts and being very happy about.
Man, and I did want to ask you about Washington. I'm glad you brought that up because that literally was going to be my last question. If you had to cast a die for one person in Washington in that backfield, who would it be? And I think that he's worth your time there with Gibson, and especially when you're looking at Ron Rivera being the guy, obviously who was the overlord of the of the Christian McCaffrey experience these last couple seasons. So yeah, man, this is good stuff. This is great stuff. My brain is I'm all over the place right now, Zach.
See, I love having you on because you and every time we talk about you, J. Mike, I say the same thing. I feel like I get repetitive, but you always ask questions that I never would think of. And when you do that, all of a sudden you set me off in a direction that I needed to go, but I didn't know was there. And that is more valuable to me than somebody giving me information, because this is, you set me off in uncharted territory, and it's a lot of fun for me, and it's also enlightening, and hopefully other people get something out of it too.
Big bro, my pleasure, and thank you for having me today. And again, Kyle, love you, bro. Your seat's still warm, and I'm still okay with the smell of lobster down here in the depths here of Dynasty Dummies headquarters.
Do you have anything you want to say before I roll us out of here?
No, I think that there's. Well, I guess I do. I feel like there's so much to be explored with this topic, and I find that again, running backs tend to be the keys to a lot of dynasty teams. They tend to be the keys to a lot of success. And even though We're seeing this weird place where when you at first glance, Miles Sanders at RB11 feels so strange, and then everything behind him doesn't look great because we've got the old guard and we've got a bunch of guys that are, the Kenyon Drakes of the world and the folks who we waited so long. And is he now going to be Lamar Miller? And there's so much going on, basically outside of the top 10 at running back, but there's so much to be leveraged in terms of value, in terms of production, and when it comes to really finding the places, finding the edges, and finding those players that lots of people are not going to be excited about. Your Melvin Gordon in Denver, those types of things. I feel like there's so much to be explored there. But no, again, thank you, man, for having me. I'm grateful to be able to chop it up with you. This has been good for the soul for me. So thank you.
It's always a blast having you on. And if you guys know, but if you don't know, J Mike does the best show on the Dynasty Funhouse Podcast Network, the Dummy Blitz. He 15 minutes gives you more knowledge than I could impart to you in 4 hours.
That's blatantly not true.
It definitely is. We'll Twitter poll that, and you the Blitz will win out. But the whole DFPN network is just it's an absolute blast. We've got a whole bunch of great guys. We've got the occasional fun house with Kevin Cotillo and Sal, and sometimes Steve. We've got the Split Takes show with Kevin and Russ. We've got you on the Blitz. We've got Riley and Matt Foreman doing kind of our Debbie work when that rolls around, and some college stuff. And we've got FF Trader Joe. Man, Joe does such amazing work on the social media side of things. If you ever see anything that gets tweeted out that makes us look good, it is Joe.
It is
hands down. And so it's a great group of guys. It's a fun group to be a part of, and we hope you want to be a part of this too. Come ride with us. Listen to the shows, interact with us. We're everywhere on Twitter. We're pretty friendly. Like I said, it's a great group. It's people that actually care about the other people in this community, and so it's a really fun place to be. And Kyle's there too. I miss Kyle, man. This has been really really tough, not being able to be in the same room, gaze longingly across the table, into his eyes and say, Aaron Jones sucks. And watching him roll his eyes when I do my opening song. We'll get back there, but in the meantime, you can follow him at Caleb Reck. You can follow the show at Dynasty Dummies. If you want to get a hold of us, you can email us at dynastydummies@gmail.com. The show's Twitter handle is at Dynasty Dummies. J Mike is at J Mike Check. Usually Kyle prompts me for that, but I'm doing it all on my own. And I am at Tacit Assassin 13. This has been the Dynasty Dummies. Thank you for joining us.